Morning, ladies and gentlemen, and all our viewers. I'd like to welcome all of you to the KIAS-BUFS International Conference that is organized for the celebrating the journal Suvarnabhumi's Scopus Index milestone. The main theme of the conference is roles and functions of ASEAN sub-region for ASEAN community, developmental cooperation, and regional security. My name is Bokyeung from KIAS, and it is a great pleasure to carry on today's conference. At this time, I would like to invite Professor Dong-Yeob, Director of KIAS-BUFS, to deliver his opening remarks. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. Good morning, all conference participants and online audiences. This is Dong-Yeob Kim, Director of KIAS-BUFS. I would like to thank and welcome everyone from Korea and abroad for attending this online international conference. This international conference is specially organized in order to celebrate our journal, Suvarnabhumi's Scopus Index milestone. There are many people who have helped publish the journal Suvarnabhumi. Among others, the chief editor, Professor Victor Terry King, as well as the editorial board members. Their advice and cooperation have contributed greatly to development of the journal. Since the publication of the first issue in 2009, Suvarnabhumi has been published up to volume 14, number 1 in January this year. Until today, Suvarnabhumi has been devoted to discover and to publish new research findings in the field of Southeast Asian studies from various aspects beyond and across the academic disciplines. The annual international conference organized by us has been a venue for many contributors to meet each other and share their thought. We are hoping that Suvarnabhumi will be an academic journal that discovers and publishes even more serious and significant research outcomes and manuscripts in the field of Southeast Asian studies. In particular, I hope that the journal become a medium for exchanging and sharing the academic views between and among the Southeast Asians from Korea, Southeast Asia, and other countries and regions. It is regrettable that we could not help but holding this conference virtually due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, as announced to the all paper presenters, KIAS-BUFS will invite you all to the face-to-face international conference to be held in Busan in this coming October. We will release the formal announcement for the October conference soon. We look forward to meeting you in person at the times. The theme of this conference is roles and functions of ASEAN sub-regions for ASEAN community, developmental cooperation, and regional security. This theme came from the research agenda that KIAS-BUFS has been conducting under the financial support from the National Research Foundation of Korea. The 6-year research agenda is a strategic study for the advancement of Korean government's new Southern policy by linking ASEAN sub-regions. Based on the deep understanding of ASEAN as a unified entity of Southeast Asian region, we will focus on the research to enhance the relationship between ASEAN and Republic of Korea. The KIAS-BUFS had conducted a Korean government-sponsored 10-year research project from 2009 to 2019 with a research agenda titled The Reconstruction and Construction of Southeast Asia as a Whole, Building Southeast Asian Studies on Compounding Area Studies and Cultural Studies. based on the accumulated knowledge on Southeast Asian region, we would like to expand our research scope to more practical aspects with policy orientation. In particular, we will look for the various factors that prerequisite to achieve the vision of the ASEAN community. And we will also work together with ASEAN scholars to find ways to cooperate between ASEAN and Republic of Korea as strategic partners. In addition, we will continue to pursue multidisciplinary research on Southeast Asia in order to deepen our understanding of Southeast Asian region and the people. I hope this international conference will serve as an opportunity to trigger academic interest in ASEAN and ASEAN sub-regions. The KIAS-BUFS International Conference is not just about presenting and discussing papers. It is also an important objective to build a wide and robust academic network by promoting exchanges and cooperation among the participants. Although this international conference is held online, I think it would have been an opportunity for mutual understanding while having various communications in the preparation process. Based on this mutual understanding, we hope to develop a closer relationship in the future. Lastly, I would like to thank everyone who worked hard in preparing for this international conference. And I hope it will be a pleasant and meaningful time for everyone who joined this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Kim, for your remarks. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Kim Hyung, President of Busan University of Foreign Studies, for his welcome address. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President Kim Hyung with a warm round of applause.
총장님 마이크 부탁드리겠습니다.
Oh, I'm sorry. Good morning. This is Kim Hyung, President of Busan University of Foreign Studies. 들리시죠? First, I would like to congratulate the hosting of the 2022 International Conference organized by the Korea Institute for ASEAN Studies of Busan University of Foreign Studies. I'm glad that many prominent scholars from various countries have participated in this year's conference. In particular, this year's KIAS-BUFS International Conference celebrates the listing of Suwarna Phumi, the academic journal published by KIAS in Scopus. Above all, I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the dedication of many people who have made this possible, including Professor Victor T. King, the editor-in-chief. I believe that the listing of Suwarna Phumi in Scopus will prove that BUFS and the KIAS are both key leading institutions in Southeast Asia research within Korea, and that it will serve as a foundation for their development as a global research institute. The annual KIAS-BUFS International Conference has been the basis for the qualitative progress and development of Suwarna Phumi. I hope scholars who attended this conference will continue to take an interest in Suwarna Phumi and submit these papers. In addition, I do hope that Suwarna Phumi will be a place for Southeast Asia researchers to exchange and share their research. I believe this year's international conference, under the timely theme of role and functions of ASEAN sub-regions for ASEAN community, development, cooperation, and regional security, is a valuable opportunity for many scholars to share their various perspectives and expertise. Busan University of Foreign Studies has the status of hub for ASEAN research and education in Korea. At the university level, we will actively support the successful hosting of the KIAS-BUFS International Conference. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this international conference is being held online, but I look forward to meeting you in person in Busan at another international conference, which is scheduled to be held on October this year. Lastly, I'd like to thank all related parties, including Kim Dong-Yeob, Director of the Korea Institute for ASEAN Studies, for their effort in preparing and hosting the 2022 KIAS-BUFS International Conference. Thank you.
Thank you, President Kim. Next welcome address must be delivered by Professor Victor T. King, who is also the chief editor of the journal Swarnabhumi. He used to be in Brunei until recently, but now he is staying in UK, his home country. He informed us that he might be difficult to attend the opening session because of the time differences, but he will show up later in the conference. So we are expecting to hear his welcome address at the next conference. So I'd like to wrap up the opening session here and move to the session 1. And thank you so much. So we will start session 1 at 10:20.
Yes.
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 Okay, thank you, Dr. Rahman. May I share my screen? So while I am doing that now, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this international conference. This is my first time to join the international conference of KIAS-BUFS, and I would like also to congratulate the organization for getting the Scopus index status for its journal Swarnabhumi. So I'd like to start off my presentation this morning. Can you see my screen? The title of my presentation is Cooperation for Sustainable Development in ASEAN, Opportunities, Challenges, and Prospects. Now, we all know that ASEAN was established more than 50 years ago. And during that time, sustainable development and environmental protection were not yet expressly recognized as important concerns of the regional organizations. However, eventually, it was integrated into the agenda of ASEAN, such that presently, ASEAN has managed to take steps towards sustainable development by coming up with a framework for environmental cooperation. So in this paper, I would like to look into how ASEAN as a regional body has fared in terms of its vision to promote regional cooperation in the area of sustainable development. So maybe some of you have followed the COP26 last November, and in that conference of parties meeting, the UN Framework on Climate Change conference parties, more widely known as COP26, the ASEAN came up with its own statement, no? And basically that the ASEAN member states reiterated their commitment to their respective nationally determined contributions, and especially in addressing the challenges brought about by climate change, depending on their responsibilities and circumstances. So in this paper, I would like to address the following questions. Well, I'm sure that like everyone else, this is a work in progress still. No? So, but initially, these are the questions that I would like to address. What mechanisms have been established by ASEAN to promote sustainable development, particularly in environmental protection and climate change policies? Because sustainable development is really a big concept, meaning that there are many areas that can be covered with by the concept of sustainable development that includes economic concerns. However, I'm merely focusing on environmental protection and a little bit about climate change policies. Number two, in which specific concerns have ASEAN states promoted environmental cooperation? So for addressing this second question and the third question, how did the concrete courses of action taken by the regional body advance regional cooperation? I will discuss two specific cases. So I will only highlight certain aspects of cooperation that have been made through these courses of action taken in these two areas. Finally, out of the discussion, I wish to draw out the opportunities, challenges, and prospects for cooperation in environmental protection and climate change in the region. Okay, so to begin with, of course, because this paper is about regional cooperation and sustainable development, again, it is very important to recognize how ASEAN looks at regional cooperation. And definitely, there is a particular context to the creation or to the establishment of ASEAN in 1967. So as I mentioned earlier, in 1967, in 1967, ASEAN has not yet recognized the environment as a concern for cooperation. However, 10 years after its creation, the importance of cooperation had been recognized in the area of sustainable development. Although at that time, ASEAN has not really used the term sustainable development yet. Okay. However, solutions for specific courses of action for the concerns at the time were not easily realized, are not easily realized. So after more than 50 years, although there is already a wide recognition of the need to cooperate on environmental issues and concerns, particularly on the ones that are common and are transboundary, states are also highly likely to consider their economic interests first. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that there are also constraints on how ASEAN looks at sustainable development and regional cooperation, of course, to be able to achieve that end. So there is such a thing that is always referred to as the ASEAN way, and this has been observed by those who are studying this particular area of cooperation, which has been termed, so I'm also going to use the term environmental cooperation throughout this presentation. So this ASEAN way has been evident in addressing environmental issues and concerns within the ASEAN region. However, as years went on, cooperation for sustainable development has been increasing. The recognition for it has been increasing within ASEAN, such that the ASEAN was able to craft the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community Blueprint, or the ASCC Blueprint 2025. Prior to this, I will discuss it later, there was a first ASCC Blueprint. The ASCC 2025 envisions an ASEAN community that engages and benefits the peoples, and I highlight the following adjectives in this statement. That the ASEAN community is inclusive, sustainable, resilient, and dynamic. So what have been the initiatives of ASEAN that with respect to environmental cooperation? So as soon as the recognition came out in 1977, in 1978, the ASEAN Experts Group on Environment was established. And then this was followed in 1989 by the establishment of the ASEAN Senior Officials on the Environment. So up to now, this is the one that is actually working, and we will see later in the institutional framework that was developed by ASEAN over the years. The establishment of the AEGE is believed to be the very beginning of ASEAN cooperation on environmental issues, such that in 1989, the AEGE was elevated to become the ASEAN Senior Officials on the Environment. And this, according to Takahashi in a publication in 2001, became the basis of the organizational structure for environmental cooperation that ASEAN has to this day. So I will show that later on. So from 1978 to 1992, ASEAN adopted 3 ASEAN environmental programs called the ASEP. So there were 3, so ASEP 1, 2, and 3. Basically, these programs involved technical meetings and workshops of the AEGE and the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Environment, or AMME, to identify priority areas and to craft programs of action. The first AMME meeting was held in 1981 and resulted in the Manila Declaration on the ASEAN Environment. It is also worth noting that ASEP 1, that was the plan from 1978 to 1982, involved external actors such as international organizations and non-government organizations such as the United Nations Environment Program, the UNEP, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. While ASEP 1 laid the foundations for environmental cooperation in the ASEAN region, ASEP 2 from 1983 to 1987 focused on establishing formal dialogues and included in its agenda the identification of potential donors. Finally, for ASEP 3, which was the plan for 1988 to 1992, it reviewed the implementation of the first 2 ASEPs and added environmental problems in urban centers as a priority area of concern. So following the implementation of the ASEPs, the ASEAN Strategic Plan of Action on the Environment, or ASPEN here, was implemented in the 1990s. The specific initiatives of ASEAN that are related to promoting regional cooperation in environmental concerns and sustainable development are going to be discussed more specifically in the following slides. Okay, so on the 30th year of ASEAN in 1997, the member countries adopted ASEAN Vision 2020. So consequently, the Hanoi Plan of Action, okay, was adopted, and in part 6, I quote, okay, it stated, it is entitled, rather, Protect the Environment and Promote Sustainable Development. So therefore, in the Hanoi Plan of Action, it already became very direct, the concern of ASEAN for the environment. And the document also, that part of the document also contained 15 points that highlight the priority areas concerning the environment. So in the interest of time, I will not go over the 15 points anymore. Okay, but just say that these points signify the intent of ASEAN to deepen regional cooperation in sustainable development and particularly in environmental protection. So the succeeding steps taken by ASEAN further concretize these action points. Okay, so to continue, in 2009 on ASEAN Day, ASEAN committed to achieving a green ASEAN. Okay, and it stated that ASEAN aims to become an environmentally sustainable ASEAN community by effectively adapting to ever-changing circumstances and improving the region's environmental sustainability. Thus, by the following years, the ASCC Blueprint 2015, I believe it was in 2006, after the ASEAN Vision 2020 was crafted, that this document came out. So in the ASCC Blueprint 2015, environmental sustainability was identified as one of its key pillars, and it expresses the intent of ASEAN members, again, to strengthen environmental cooperation in various areas based upon the principles of equity and public participation. So finally, we have the current basis of environmental cooperation within ASEAN, which is the ASCC, the ASEAN Sociocultural Community Blueprint 2025, which further emphasizes inclusiveness and enhances commitment, participation, and social responsibility among the ASEAN peoples in a region that is envisioned to be inclusive, sustainable, resilient, and dynamic. Okay. So, okay, now we go to the institutional framework for environmental cooperation. So, I think I consider this already as an achievement of ASEAN. The fact that there is this framework, organizational structure, if you may, institutional framework that is the basis for working within the regional body to coordinate the work of all the member states with regard to environmental protection. So, following the adoption of the ASCC blueprint in 2015, ASEAN's environmental cooperation focused on implementing the proposed activities stated in that blueprint. Presently, this is the institutional framework, okay, which consists of, if we can look at the slide here, the ASEAN on top, the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Environment, okay, is there. And then we have the ASEAN senior officials on the environment. And under it are the 7 ASEAN working groups on the different areas of the environment. Okay. So the AMME here meets once every 2 years, and it is mandated to provide policy and strategic guidance related to ASEAN cooperation on environment. Okay, while the ASEAN senior official on the environment, this is the one that is really more involved. No, I would say the ASEAN meets once a year to oversee the implementation of the ASPEN, the ASEAN Strategic Plan on the Environment, and the ASCC Blueprint 2025. The chairmanship of the ASEAN, the chairmanship of the ASEAN is rotated among the ASEAN member states every 2 years. And then, as I mentioned earlier, under the ASEAN are the different ASEAN working groups. Okay, so each ASEAN working group is chaired by an ASEAN member state based on expression of interest, therefore voluntary, and serves for 3 years. The main responsibility of the ASEAN working group is to promote and enhance cooperation among ASEAN member states in implementing the ASCC Blueprint 2025. And as noted earlier, the ASEAN working groups on the environment meet annually to discuss policies and implementation methodologies in each specific issue area. So, okay. Later on, I will make some comments on some of the observations that have been made on the work of the working groups. Okay, sorry. Okay. Now, there are 2 areas of cooperation that I would like to focus on. Okay, 5 more minutes. Sorry, I'm not looking at the chat. Okay, so quickly, there are 2 areas of cooperation that are that I would like to focus on. These are on transboundary haze pollution and biodiversity conservation. Okay, so why did I choose these 2 areas to look at? Basically, when I review the literature, these are the 2 areas that have always been mentioned by authors to be the more advanced in the areas of cooperation. So why more advanced? Well, perhaps there are some members here in the audience who know this problem very much. So in the 1990s, one of the most serious environmental challenges in the ASEAN region came about, and this is the transboundary haze pollution, such that by 2002, so I will not tell the entire narrative anymore or story anymore, such that by 2002, the region has adopted the agreement on transboundary haze pollution, and this provides the establishment of the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Transboundary Haze Pollution Control. So it is moving towards that, from 2002, 20 years ago. Okay. In 2016, with regard to this issue, ASEAN has adopted the roadmap on ASEAN cooperation towards transboundary haze pollution control with means of implementation. The other area of concern of cooperation, area of cooperation is biodiversity conservation. And for this one, this has, I think, the most advanced one, although the work also is limited. In 2005, the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity was established to facilitate cooperation and coordination among ASEAN member states and with relevant national government, regional and international organizations on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of such biodiversity in the ASEAN region. The ACB is hosted by the Philippines, and it has its center in the University of the Philippines, Los Baños campus. Okay. So now, very quickly now, what have been based on the story, over the years, what ASEAN has gone through, what have been the challenges. Okay. So just a quick identification of the challenges. Number one, the slow, complex, and long decision-making process. The organizational structure and the working group setup has also been seen by others as a constraint, even the voluntary nature of the chairmanship, because really it depends on the resources of the volunteer country. So this all poses some challenges. But I would also I'd like to point out that a new challenge, I think this is very important, is that the attention of the ASEAN member states had been put on addressing, of course, it's very important, COVID-19 pandemic. For the opportunities, so maybe this is the last point. I think that on the whole, just to conclude, everything ASEAN has already achieved much. However, it has to move forward and deepen that regional cooperation. And these are the points that can be harnessed as opportunities. The binding agreements that have already been made, the resolutions and declarations, the existing plans of action and the blueprints. Of course, the vibrant civil society participation. I wish I had the time to discuss this, but anyway, maybe if there will be a Q&A or in other venues, I will be able to discuss these points. Finally, also collaboration with other external institutions who might be interested, like the dialogue partners of ASEAN, who might be interested in pushing forward the agenda for the environment. So I'll skip the prospects and just summarize it there. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much. Kamsahamnida.
Mr. Chair, then good morning. And actually, I'm very happy to be here. It's always my great pleasure to be with this meaningful conference. So I very enjoyed reading the Professor Ruth's papers, and as you heard just now, the Professor Ruth's paper deals with timely, very critical issues that called the sustainable development. So she elaborate the historical development and the trajectories of the ASEAN cooperation on environment, and then focusing on the several issues, the environment process and then transboundary haze issues and biodiversity, and which are all has increasingly emerged as a serious and issues in development of the ASEAN cooperation, and not only at the national levels of the ASEAN member state. So in general, I agree with the main argument of the Professor Ruth and her observation, which make us to have the great understanding of some ASEAN's cooperation on those issues. So as she correctly mentioned that some of the accomplishment of the ASEAN in environmental cooperation issues actually has been very limited. But meanwhile, other issues like the transboundary haze pollution and biodiversity has made us a kind of the progress in sense that. But in general, so when we discuss about the ASEAN's cooperation on various issues, so it is very openly heard. The point is that generally it lack of the proper technologies and then lack of the financial resources were actually pointed as a weakness of the ASEAN's cooperation. So that is the thing. I think we are aware that, and then but we also have to look forward that somehow the alternative way to tackling those issues, but not only limited this environment issue, but other areas of the cooperation. But these environment issues, and then regarding the sustainable development, that is I think that is somehow more important, because it's not only the concern at the ASEAN level, but it's global issues. But in general, ASEAN, we should admit that, and in many ways we little lagged behind that in pursuing and protecting the environment issues. So while I agree with that, the major point, so I want to raise some questions. Actually, it's not the question, but something need to be considered in the papers. So the first thing is that the concept of the sustainable development, actually, here mainly regarding that environment and then the biodiversity and health issues. But as you know, that the sustainable development has evolved globally gradually, and now it has the considers with a wide range of the issues. So to make fair that the origin of this sustainable development concept has emerged from that, how we can make the coexistence of the economic growth and environment preservations, right? So now sustainable development consists of the many social elements such as poverty, genders, education, and so on, etc. Right? So as we know that, observe that at the UN level, so sustainable development goal after the Millennium Development Goal has been the reading and the agendas, or kind of the program to cover that all kind of the serious challenges we faces on the name of the sustainable development, right? So in this sense, I may just wonder that how you define the sustainable development, including social related issues. And I didn't mean that, I don't mean that you have to include all kind of the sustainable SDG issues as UN has done. But what I want to say is that in the context of the ASEAN, actually sustainable development, that is not only related that as ASEAN defined that, not only the work of the ASEAN social cultural community, but actually sustainable development should be related with the other part of the ASEAN community, such as economic communities and political security even, right? Because that, as you know, that sustainable development heavily related that the economic growth, economic activity, basically the way of the production and the way of the consumption, right? So without the tackling the economic activity, to achieve that the goal of the sustainable development should be very difficult. So while we read the ASEAN's trajectory, so I think I'd like to say that this is the kind of the miscategorization. So only thing is that sustainable development matters are putting in the pocket of the ASEAN social cultural community. So it caused that lack of the attention and political will, and even the financial and then personal resources and so on. So relatively social cultural community pillar, that is the less attractive to those that were capable agent, such as the big business firms and some multinational companies and so on. So by reading those ASEAN development in a more critical way, so we have to revisit that how we can define and then bring it into the context of the ASEAN. And so we need to also revisit the concept of the ASEAN communities and the kind of the categorization. So my main point is that, but also somehow the remaining challenge for the ASEAN is that how we can coordinate the cooperation or work with other international organizations at the national levels and so on. So ASEAN should be considered as an important agent to make more progress with the balanced cooperation between national and international organizations and so on. So here the thing is that ASEAN way, it has been criticized for the ineffectiveness or the less capability in dealing with some the newly emerging challenges, especially the sustainable development, also environment is a critical issue that ASEAN way could be seen as a kind of the hurdle or the weakness. But my last point is that but ASEAN way is not given. So as condition that has formed that ASEAN way changes. So ASEAN way itself to changes. So I'd like to say that we should expect more, then we should encourage ASEAN to do more things in more active ways in dealing with sustainable development. So I may stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Professor Ruth.
Yeah, just to
and
briefly
Professor
reply.
Ruth. All right, sure. Yeah, you have
Yeah,
1
just
minute.
just 1 minute. Yeah,
Yeah,
just to
sure.
reply. Thank you very much, Professor Kim, for your very valuable comments. They're very helpful. I think I just want to point out that yeah, I agree that the concept of sustainable development is really broad. And yeah, in my paper, I just focused basically on where ASEAN has placed it. No? So it's in the ASCC. But I agree that the balance, most of the states within ASEAN really have to strike that balance between economic growth and protecting the environment. Well, I know I don't have enough time to discuss the other points, but I just want to say thank you very much. And I agree, and I'll try to incorporate those points that I picked up from Dr. Kim in my paper. Once again, thank you, and I really appreciate my participation for the first time in this international conference.
All right. Thank you, Professor Kim and Professor Ruth. I think I will give 2 or 3 minutes for the audience. If any of you wants to ask a question for Professor Ruth, anyone, you can use raise hand feature, or you can type out your question in the chat box. Any question? All right, it seems that no one wants to ask a question. Any question? All right, and there is Mr. Rolly Tarampas raising his hand. Please, sir. Ask
Thank
your
you.
question.
Thank you, Ruth, and that was a very nice discussion. May I know which country or countries and countries' programs best serve these initiatives regarding the environment?
Are you referring to the 2 cases that I have mentioned? So
Yeah,
for
yeah.
transboundary, yeah, for the transboundary haze pollution, it's mainly for those that are affected directly by the issue. So so that's basically Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And for the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, well, it serves, in my paper, I discussed the function of the center, no? But in short, basically it's a coordinating center, and it moves because there are projects that are hosted there, and it's a good case to study really, because there's networking of different institutions that are involved. You know, when we talk about the environment, I guess there is really not much disagreement on those countries that have to protect the biodiversity. But that is just a very simple, like issue, no? So I wish we have the time to really expound on this. But again, I'll come back to one of the main challenges in the region is really to balance the need for economic growth of the countries and the need for environmental protection. So ideally, it should be that all ASEAN member states should be benefited by the existence of that institutional framework. However, the limitation is that the leadership of each ASEAN working group is voluntary and depends on the resources of the volunteer member state. So that is my short answer to the question. Sorry, it's difficult to answer with very limited time. Thank you.
I share my screen.
Please, please.
Okay. I hope you can see my
Yeah, we can
screen
see it.
very clearly. So good morning to everyone, and it's my pleasure to participate actually for the first time in the KIAS-BUFS International Conference, although many of our colleagues from the University of the Philippines have attended this conference face-to-face. We are happy to participate here because Professor Kim Dong-Yeob, of course, is one of our graduates in the PhD program of the University of the Philippines Department of Political Science. And of course, congratulations on having your journal, Jane Scopus accreditation. So my focus is on human security in the ASEAN political security community, assessing success, challenges and lessons in ASEAN human security cooperation in disaster management and emergency relief. And I'm very happy that this conference came up because it's an opportunity for me to combine some of my interest and research projects that I pursued in the past 15 years, human security, mainstreaming human security in ASEAN, focusing on disaster risk reduction and management and humanitarianism. But many of these research projects were done with different emphasis and focus, but this conference has provided me an opportunity to combine some of this recent interest and focus on ASEAN mainstreaming of human security in disaster management and emergency response. Basically, I'm responding to several contexts in ASEAN. Of course, ASEAN's response to non-traditional security challenges that we sometimes refer to in the literature as human security remains largely informed by the state-centric security paradigm. And the term human security is not used, and we cannot find it in the documents of ASEAN, but many scholars have attempted to highlight elements of human security in ASEAN documents and ASEAN procedures, particularly in terms of ASEAN community documents and commitments. But the ASEAN Political Security Community, or the APSC, is not devoid of human security elements and does have a bearing on the human security situation in the region. In the APSC and its blueprints, we can point out a number of human security problems, and this include disaster management and emergency relief that ASEAN member states are called upon to address and provide opportunities for humanitarian assistance, protection, and empowerment of civilians and community. So very briefly, what I'll try to do in the next 15 minutes is to focus on the objective of looking into the state of implementation of APSC and APSC blueprints in the area of disaster management and emergency relief. The research questions are there some achievements or progress? Was ASEAN able to implement its commitments and action programs in this area? And what are the challenges in human security cooperation? So let me start very briefly with what is human security as a concept. Human security became a global concept in the 1990s. It's still a contested concept among academics and international development workers, but based on available literature, it focuses on 3 dimensions: freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity. While freedom from fear was initially associated with conflict-related issues, and freedom from want was initially connected with economic issues, we see that these three dimensions are actually interrelated and can coexist. Human security addresses the protection of people, meaning both at the individual and the community level, from what we call critical or severe and pervasive or widespread threats and situations, using processes that build on people's strengths and aspirations. So human security covers both conflict and development aspects for peace and sustainable development. And it was the 1994 UNDP Human Development Report, a report that first mentioned human security and pinpointed 7 dimensions of human security threats. In terms of the human security approach and its relevance in ASEAN, it targets the vulnerable and directly addresses factors that increase vulnerability to poverty, disease, conflict, and disempowerment. It also requires mechanisms to be established at different levels of government and a focus on governance to protect communities from threats. And this refers to, of course, to multi-level governance. The approach also covers both top-down or protection approaches as well as bottom-up or empowerment approaches. The various dimensions of human security are, of course, intertwined and related, and achieving human security requires multi-level governance, localization, and resilience. Now, let's look very briefly into the history of ASEAN and its role in disaster management and emergency relief before the founding of the ASEAN community and its 3 pillars. Obviously, we're aware that Southeast Asia's geographical location makes it vulnerable to natural hazards. In 1971, there was the first meeting of the ASEAN Expert Group on Disaster Management. In 1976, ASEAN stressed the importance of cooperation in the area of disaster management, and it issued an ASEAN Declaration on Mutual Assistance on Natural Disasters. Unfortunately, there was no progress reached, mainly due to the strategic environment at that time. It was still the period of the Cold War, and the main goal of ASEAN was, of course, regional stability and minimization of interstate conflicts. However, after 2000, there was more progress in this area because of the changed strategic environment, the end of the Cold War, and of course, the recognition of non-traditional security and the increasing disasters in Southeast Asia, particularly the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. We can also mention that among many scholars studying human security, Rizal Sukma mentioned that there's a presumed tension between human security and political economic stability among ASEAN members, but the entry of human security was also viewed with suspicion by some ASEAN member states and leaders, primarily because they connect it with human rights. However, the 1997 to 1998 financial crisis challenged ASEAN's confidence in state-led political and economic security, and it put into the center of ASEAN the importance of human security as a prerequisite for stability. In 2003, the first regional commitment to create the ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management, composed of senior official heads of national agencies, led to priority programs and projects in disaster management. Then, of course, the Bali Concord II in 2003 established an ASEAN community of 3 pillars. It's an ambitious agenda that seemed to cover both freedom from fear and freedom from want dimensions of human security. There's now emphasis on the people, which is a reflection of ASEAN's long-standing position subscribing to comprehensive security. The Bali Concord II, however, has no explicit mention of disaster management, but it mentions comprehensive security and intra-regional cooperation in concerns that are transboundary in nature, and that, of course, includes disaster management. The APSC Blueprint 2015, which was which came out in 2009, mentioned that the blueprint, together with the 2 other community blueprints, they also did not mention human security, though it contained 5 elements of human security including disaster management and emergency response. However, the mechanisms available in the blueprints are still state-centric. In the ATSC Blueprint 2015, it calls for strengthening of cooperation in disaster management and emergency response to overcome new disaster risks. And these competencies were added in the ASEAN Defense Ministerial meetings. What is, in a way, very revolutionary for ASEAN was the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, which came out in 2008. It's a legally binding document, which, according to many observers, is a first of its kind that led to more concrete commitments in succeeding summits. And then the ATSC Blueprint of 2025 reinforced the security goals of ASEAN and political security cooperation, and there is now more emphasis on inclusivity and community, which again did not mention human security, but it's more in line to the empowerment aspect of human security cooperation. In the ATSC Blueprint of 2025, it shows ASEAN's commitment to strengthen cooperation in disaster management and emergency response through a number of things. First, making ADMER the main cooperation platform for this, strengthening the ASEAN Center for Humanitarian Assistance, which is based in Jakarta, established in 2011 as the coordinating body with all stakeholders and partners, including dialogue partners. However, the blueprint did not mention localization and empowerment. Okay, I have 5 more minutes. Thank you. Okay, and then, of course, in 2016, the ASEAN Declaration on One ASEAN, One Response was made. This created more opportunities for human security mainstreaming with greater institutionalization of the AHA Center as the main body for mobilization and coordination with partners, and the transformation of ASEAN as a site for humanitarian diplomacy. So what is the status of the implementation of the ATSC Blueprint in disaster management and emergency relief? Generally, implementation process of ASEAN agreements and commitments has been problematic due to problems of compliance and effective implementation, and ASEAN's capacity to implement cooperative measures in the ATSC Blueprint can be seen as more difficult and the least successful compared to the other 2 pillars. This is also according to the ASEAN Secretariat. However, there were more progress achieved after the end of the Cold War in political and security cooperation, especially in the area of disaster management and emergency relief. There were some progress in the implementation of the ATSC, especially with the ADMER. One is in the institution building among national disaster management offices in many ASEAN member countries. The establishment, of course, of the AHA Center in 2011, the establishment of the ADMER Partnership Group, or SEPG, composed of local and international NGOs to support people-centered regional efforts, and the AHA Center in training and responses, emerging broader regional humanitarian diplomacy beyond natural hazards with humanitarian responses in conflict areas, but this, of course, the intervention is in post-conflict settings in Marawi and in the Rakhine state in Myanmar. However, there are a number of interrelated problems. Of course, there is still reluctance to broaden the scope of disasters beyond natural hazards to include other disruptive events like conflicts and pandemics, including COVID-19, though the AHA Center and ADMER can be very important institutions and processes that can provide cooperation in this area. And this is affected by the second challenge, the traditional state-centric security approach and the ASEAN way, which has prevented more efforts at the regional cooperation in disaster management because of the reluctance to surrender a number of competencies. There are difficulties in achieving genuine localization beyond national governments, even if localization is very important in empowerment and humanitarian interventions. Of course, we know ASEAN countries differ in terms of the levels of decentralization and central-local relations. There are variations in capacity building at the regional, national, and local levels. There are financial inequities and overdependence on external financing. In 2019, the operations of the AHA Center, in the operational budget of the AHA Center, 91% of the budget were actually from dialogue partners instead of ASEAN member states. There are also problems in terms of creating greater transparency, accountability, and suitability in cooperation in the area of disaster management, and the problems of closer coordination and smoother coordination mechanisms. So what are some concluding remarks and ways forward? There are common problems for most APSC areas beyond disaster management and emergency response. Cooperation is still mostly interstate. Progress is constrained by the nature of ASEAN cooperation itself, with the primacy of the principles of sovereignty and non-interference. There's still a need to mainstream human security elements, and of course, it's not explicitly mentioned, particularly in the area of empowerment. However, there are some caveats because there are elements of progress in ASEAN cooperation in disaster management and emergency relief. Number one, while national governments still direct the pace of cooperation, the vulnerability of the region and the immediacy of disasters have led to a type of regional cooperation that is more binding compared to other areas with growing recognition of other partners. Despite the ASEAN way, the level of professionalization, mechanism set up, and variety of stakeholders at multi-levels open more opportunities for mainstreaming human security. But finally, the challenges mentioned must be resolved for ASEAN cooperation to move forward and human security achieved. And at the same time, meeting these challenges will require efforts on the part of state and non-state actors within ASEAN, and also the participation of dialogue partners and other stakeholders in ASEAN cooperation and strengthening of regionalism. So thank you very much. Kamsahamnida. Thank you.
I think you are still muted, Professor.
I'm sorry. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ella. It's nice to meet you even though it's online. Nice to see you. And it is quite interesting and insightful papers. I enjoyed reading your paper and learned a lot about the topic you introduced. I will try to make a very brief comments on the papers. The issue of human security is a very complex and controversial one. As you mentioned in the paper, it is politically charged and highly sensitive concept. But it is an important value for ASEAN in order to go beyond the scope of individual countries and to achieve a solid ASEAN community. For ASEAN member countries who experienced colonialism for a long period, the concept of human security would be uneasy to accept because it could encroach the hard-earned national sovereignty. However, ASEAN should overcome the past memories and focus on building a future-oriented ASEAN community in this fast-changing and highly competitive global world. As for moving forward, it is desirable to discuss about and to come up with an acceptable conceptual scope of human security at the ASEAN level, rather than simply use the existing controversial definition of human security. In this context, by dealing with the disaster management and emergency relief as a common security issue, this paper gives a significant and meaningful implication to the direction of ASEAN security communities. As a discussant, I would like to add a few suggestions for the order to consider. First of all, it seems better to reorganize the conceptual discussions more concisely. Dr. Ella almost spent 4 pages to describe about many peripheral concepts of human securities. And it seems also necessary to explain the conceptual scope of disaster and to explain how it is connected to human security that you conceptualized. And I hope this paper to be more analytical. The existing literature and ASEAN political security community blueprint documents are major references in this paper. I guess it seems desirable to analyze some empirical cases in order to improve the quality of the paper. For example, as mentioned in this paper, only about 30% of ASEAN agreements and commitment of APSC agenda has been implemented. It would be useful to analyze the agenda and the reason why the 30% of the agenda was implemented and why not the 70% of them. Or as mentioned in this paper, I think it is in introduction, a careful analysis of ASEAN's response to the COVID-19 pandemic would be a good case study of human securities in the regional levels. Okay, lastly, I'd like to ask one question to Ella. As you emphasized in the discussions, the people-centered approach to human security is closely related to the realization of true democracy in the end. But in reality, the level of democracy in ASEAN member countries is very diverse and also not very much positive. So how do you think neighboring countries such as South Korea can help or cooperate in improving the level of democracy in ASEAN member countries? That is my questions. And this is all my comments. Thank you.
Rahmat, can I respond
Yes,
very
thank-
quickly? Okay,
yes.
thank you very much, Yob, for all your comments and questions. Very much appreciated. Of course, the paper I sent you was still very incomplete. Actually, the version I was able to actually revise in the past few days have more empirical cases mentioning involvement of ASEAN countries and ASEAN in Haiyan, Typhoon Nargis, and involvements in some other disasters in ASEAN. So thank you very much for your comments about the very importance of human security and the fact that it's important to find an acceptable definition for ASEAN to pursue, because it's very important, because it really captures ASEAN community building, the project of ASEAN community building, and disaster management and emergency response is a very concrete area for cooperation. It's very urgent, and it's not as controversial as maybe conflict, post-conflict, and human rights issues. Thank you very much for your suggestions. Definitely, I need to discuss some more concepts, reorganize the section on the literature review on human security and its relevance or connection with ASEAN and disaster management and emergency response. Definitely, I'll have to operationalize further disaster and what it involves, because currently ASEAN has a stricter or more limited definition of disasters. It has not yet really included disasters caused by conflicts and the pandemic, even if there is definitely a pressure, particularly in the past 2 or 3 years, with a lot of post-conflict societies, as well as, of course, COVID-19, for ASEAN to actually cooperate using ADMER and the AHA Center as the focal point for humanitarian interventions in this area. Of course, I need to include more empirical cases and sharper analysis. Definitely, as I mentioned, among the challenges, the level of democracy in ASEAN is a challenge, and that prevents more localization and more participation of non-state actors in disaster management and emergency response. And I think South Korea and other dialogue partners like Japan, the US, Australia, and other countries can play a role, not so much in terms of really pressuring state-level actors to be more open, to be more democratic, but actually to increase the capacities of non-state actors or non-national actors like local governments, civil society organizations, and ASEAN itself, and the role of experts in actually having a voice in ASEAN community building. Of course, we have to do this incrementally because there are a lot of sensitive issues related to this, but I think one way of really promoting greater democracy, localization, participation, and empowerment would be to encourage non-state actors to have a role, to have a more inclusive role in ASEAN community building. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Maria. Maybe in the next 1 or 2 minutes, if any of the audience have a question, please feel free to ask. You can use the raise hand feature, or you can type out your question in the chat box. Anyone?
I would like to.
Yes, please. 1 or 2 minutes. All right.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. I would like to suggest an issue paper and recorded after in Myanmar, 2001 February 1, military general military coup in Myanmar, 2021 February 1. Yes, at that time, from that time, Myanmar human rights have the 0 level, and human security is low level. Many of the people institute and enter the State Administrative Council. I would like to suggest you should ensure paper in the Myanmar case using the case study. And because military and government State Administrative Council does not implement the ASEAN 5 consensus until now, and officially coup that occupying the state administration, and so and most of the Myanmar people and students and we and nowadays most of the people are food shelter and human rights is very low. ASEAN cannot or cannot solve this problem and cannot interfere to fight ASEAN 5 consensus. So I suggest you should your paper the case study.
Yeah.
In Myanmar people.
Yes.
Yes, the feeling of Myanmar people. And you should study in the situation of Myanmar.
Yeah, thank you very much for your suggestion. Actually, I mentioned Typhoon Nargis already in the paper, but of course, I also mentioned, and perhaps I can expound because one challenge, of course, in greater cooperation is
Yes, Macha.
of course, the role of the military and the police forces in disaster management and emergency response in many countries. And of course, I will have to cite the case of Myanmar as one of the important areas in terms of the challenges of ASEAN trying to cooperate in the area of disaster management and response, and at the same time also the difficulty of expanding the definition of disaster at the ASEAN level to include non-natural hazards related types of disasters. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think there is one question in the chat box from Mr. Sandira Herjo. I think I will read out the question. Maybe you can answer it later. In Indonesia, human security operations for disaster management often evoke the discourse of military involvement in such operation, which is not the main duty, and there is a possibility of power military abuse. How about the ASEAN regional level see this issue?
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. It's very important to, and then related also with what I was commenting on regarding the case of Myanmar, the Indonesian case and the role of the military is very important, of course, in disaster management and response. I think this is the case in many countries because of the resources and the capacity available for the military. They are one of the stakeholders and duty bearers when it comes to disaster management and response. Definitely, they are included in the many organizations and institutions that are part of regional cooperation in disaster management and response. But the AHA Center and ADMER are now expanding to include civil society organizations, experts, and also international non-government organizations in research, training, and developing capacities for better regional disaster response or cooperation in disaster response. Definitely, it's one important challenge for many ASEAN countries, how to incorporate, but at the same time, expand the number of duty bearers and stakeholders that can cooperate in disaster management and response, so that it will not be solely monopolized by national government actors as well as military and police forces. Thank you.
All right, thank you, professors. And this is, I think, the last question for you from Ms. Zakaria from Malaysia. Is human security an extension of non-traditional security or a subset to non-traditional security, or both terms carry the same meaning and are used interchangeably in the research? Appreciate your comment.
Yes, thank you very much for the comments and questions about the concept of human security and how it's related to non-traditional security. Definitely, they are related, but human security puts emphasis on the empowerment aspect and the role of the people in the approach, because sometimes defining comprehensive security and non-traditional security can pinpoint non-military or non-state security issues, but they mainly point to protection of people instead of just including the empowerment aspect, because human security involves two approaches. One is bottom-up protection, which we can find in comprehensive and non-traditional security, but the human security approach includes also empowerment or bottom-up approaches, meaning you have a more active role on the part of the people. But definitely, they have they do have overlapping concerns in terms of the issues, the non-traditional and the human security issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so my paper for this year's conference is about the BIMP-IAGA, okay, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, East ASEAN Growth Area, past and present challenges, old and new opportunities. So for the purpose of this morning's presentation, allow me to take 2 steps back to give you a brief history of the BIMP-IAGA while highlighting the so-called goals of the East ASEAN Growth Area, some of its early engagements and initial gains, as well as missed opportunities. Well, the BIMP-IAGA over the years has grown in, organization and let's say significance. Okay, the economic transformation of the sub-region has rather been slow and limited. So I moved towards that direction, looking into the factors and forces that could help us understand this slow and limited economic transformation of the sub-region. BIMP-IAGA was formally launched in 1994, and years after that we had the Asian financial crisis, and just few years after its takeoff, the Asian financial crisis has prevented the BIMP-IAGA from building on its initial gains. And fast forward, even before the COVID-19 pandemic beginning in 2020, a number of domestic issues and interstate tensions remain and continue to challenge the economic cooperation and consequently the economic transformation of this ASEAN growth area. And then I moved to recent developments, and I would be focusing on this growing focus and engagement of China with BIMP-IAGA. So this part is like more of an exploratory section of the paper. So I may be providing an intro about China and BIMP-IAGA, and tomorrow, another participant in the conference will be presenting a paper focusing both on the US and China. So maybe that paper could also take off from my paper today, and maybe questions also about this part of my presentation could be, addressed as well by that paper tomorrow. Okay, so I look into this growing focus and engagement of China in BIMP-IAGA. So why? So let's take, for example, development in recent years can include the so-called growing, and assertive role of China, more particularly in the ASEAN region. And observers, for example, of politics and dynamics in the East ASEAN growth area seem divided over, the role of China as a strategic development partner. So on the one hand, we have those views looking at China as being able to provide opportunities for the economic transformation of the sub-region, particularly in light of the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic and the post-pandemic economic recovery. But on the other hand, China may create new challenges given its territorial and maritime disputes with some countries. So when I reach that particular section in my presentation, I will be highlighting some concerns, existing issues within the BIMP-IAGA, as well as concerns that relate to the so-called cooperation between China and BIMP-IAGA. So now a brief history about BIMP-IAGA. It was actually established formally in 1994. It was then President Ramos who initiated or who first raised this idea of establishing the growth polygon, linking southern Philippines, eastern provinces of Indonesia, and eastern Malaysia during an ASEAN Heads of State meeting in October 1992. And then a few months later, Ramos discussed the IAGA concept with Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad during his visit to Malaysia in January 1993. And that was actually like a very critical juncture in the so-called bilateral relations between Malaysia and that of the Philippines, because that was the very state visit of a Philippine president in Malaysia in almost 30 years. Months later in the same year, 1993, Ramos came to Indonesia to discuss with President Suharto the expansion of trade between their countries. And 2 months later, the Sultan of Brunei Darussalam confirmed its government participation in the IAGA. And in March 1994, the BIMP-IAGA was officially born or was formally launched. So in terms of goals, the BIMP-IAGA aims to mobilize the potential of sub-regional economic cooperation to address social and economic development of the member countries less developed and more remote territories. But of course, this exempts Brunei Darussalam. So the immediate objective is to promote increased trade, investments, and tourism in the sub-region, which covers the island economies of Brunei, North, Central, South, and Southeast Sulawesi, Central, East, West, and South Kalimantan, Maluku, and West Papua in Indonesia, formerly Irian Jaya, Sabah, Sarawak, and Labuan in Malaysia, and Mindanao and Palawan in the Philippines. So its long-term goal is actually to change the economy of BIMP-IAGA from one based on resource extraction to one based on higher order processing and non-resource based activities. During the early years of the BIMP-IAGA, with the end goal, of developing the so-called less developed and more remote territories of the member countries of the IAGA, member governments actually undertook certain actions, adjusting their national policies, developing cooperative agreements, liberalizing their cross-border arrangements. In addition to that, direct commercial air and sea linkages were also established. Policies on travel, were streamlined, and exit taxes within IAGA were basically waived. But again, just like what I said earlier, Asian financial crisis took place just 4 years, after the formal launching of BIMP-IAGA. So whatever these initial gains and early engagements that have been undertaken, they were actually dampened, or halted by the Asian financial crisis. And if you recall, 3 of these BIMP-IAGA member countries were severely impacted by the Asian financial crisis. But among these 3 member countries which were impacted by the Asian financial crisis, it was Indonesia, which was most severely hit, right? It was not just economic breakdown and political breakdown. In fact, it even resulted in the resignation of President Suharto then. So a new momentum came in 2001, and the occasion was the 7th ASEAN Summit. This new momentum actually was materialized through a so-called renewal of commitment by the member government leaders of the BIMP-IAGA. So they undertook major IAGA cooperation measures to bolster revitalization initiatives, and new development strategies and directions were basically put on the agenda. So aside from those so-called economic cooperation measures, institutional reforms were also implemented to strengthen coordination and consolidation of cooperation development activities. Not only that, linkages with strategic partners were also established. And if there's basically one important event also that took place during this period, Asian Development Bank and the ASEAN Secretariat became like critical actors or forces within the BIMP-IAGA. The Asian Development Bank was the regional development advisor of BIMP-IAGA since 1996, 2 years after it was formally launched. And beginning in 2015, the Asian Development Bank has been providing technical assistance to BIMP-IAGA. In 2004, the highest decision-making body of BIMP-IAGA formulated the roadmap to development, 2006 to 2010. It's a 5-year planning period designed to increase trade, investments, and tourism within IAGA by 2010. So it provides a basis for strategic cooperation. It identified broad targets as well as cluster sector-specific targets. So in other words, this roadmap to development was like a more detailed action plan. However, the implementation of the roadmap achieved only modest progress. So this is the first document that we could actually consider as important, to understanding how BIMP-IAGA evolved over time. In 2012, BIMP-IAGA leaders endorsed the BIMP-IAGA implementation blueprint aimed at accelerating cooperation initiatives for the period 2012 to 2016. So what may be critical about this implementation blueprint is the so-called new innovative mechanism in the form of economic corridors. So the BIMP-IAGA implementation blueprint 2012-2016 defined economic corridors as, and I quote, areas where synchronized and systematic development efforts aims to facilitate the efficient cross-border movement of factors of production and stimulate trade, tourism, investment, and other economic activities, end of quote. So the economic corridor development is a key driver in BIMP-IAGA's strategy. So it aims to promote physical and cross-border mobility within IAGA, as well as to enhance IAGA's rapid convergence and competitiveness. So there are two priority economic corridors. One is the West Borneo Economic Corridor, and the other one is the Greater Sulu-Sulawesi Corridor. And you can see there I hope you can see there the so-called territories or areas or provinces included. And BIMP-IAGA is developing a third economic corridor which will pass through the new capital city of Indonesia. And this is the East Borneo Economic Corridor. But surveys, for example, business perception about investments in BIMP-IAGA usually are focused only on the two dominant economic corridors, the West Borneo Economic Corridor and that of the Greater Sulawesi Economic Corridor. And then the third official document is the BIMP-IAGA Vision 2025. And you can see on the slide there what it aspires for, the creation of a resilient, inclusive, sustainable, and economically competitive BIMP-IAGA, or what they call as RISE BIMP-IAGA, to narrow the development gap. So in a capsule, that's a brief history of let's say, the BIMP-IAGA from its year of formal launching, or official launching, to basically this BIMP-IAGA Vision 2025. Now, I try to look at the factors and forces, that would help us understand the rather slow and limited economic transformation of BIMP-IAGA. So here, it's not an exhaustive list, but I try to capture, what basically would be, political, structural, and economic, reasons, that would help us understand, why the economic transformation of BIMP-IAGA has rather been slow and, let's say, limited. Now, studies of sub-regional economic cooperation usually identify key 4 factors, to determine the success of a growth triangle or a growth polygon. So these include 1, economic complementarity, 2, geographical proximity, 3, political commitment, and 4, infrastructure development. And I think if we try to make a checklist here and make these as standards for, evaluating the success of BIMP-IAGA, in all 4 areas, we would say like BIMP-IAGA is not necessarily doing very well. So first, the economies within IAGA do not have strong complementarities with each other. Rather than being complementary, IAGA economies are more competitive in terms of human and natural resource endowments and stages of economic development. Each component area exports and imports broadly are similar types of products, and economic links within the sub-region are essentially weak. Second, the areas in the BIMP-IAGA have not benefited significantly from the large foreign investment flows that have supported strong economic growth in the ASEAN in the early 1990s. And here we can identify maybe 2 reasons, partly due to the relative distance of the BIMP component areas from the major centers of commercial activity in each country, and partly due to the generally poor physical infrastructure and the narrow and small economic basis of the sub-region. And then third, IAGA-wide trade and investment are also impeded by complicated government regulations and procedures. So for example, there were extensive delays in the IAGA countries caused by investment approval process and the post-investment licensing system. Other constraints emanate from the lack of information on market opportunities, technical specifications, and regulatory controls, underdeveloped financial services in many areas in IAGA, for example, credit and insurance, and lack of coordination in terms of industry standards and specification across. And then here I also listed like BIMP-IAGA has relatively inadequate and poorly physical infrastructure. So the sub-region may be rich, natural resources, it has access to raw materials as well as low and semi-skilled labor, but it makes it difficult to take advantage of regional production network. Especially China has risen, to become a key competitor for low-end manufacturing, And that is a major impediment to dynamic economic cooperation in the sub-region, because of inadequacy of infrastructure, lack of adequate transport facilities and service connections within and across sub-regions. And because of these limitations, or weaknesses, you can find high transaction costs, and preventing the development, let's say, of the productive sector. And then What else did I put there? BIMP-IAGA also faces difficulties, no, brought by its big membership or numerous component areas. When it was formally established in 1994, BIMP-IAGA was just made up of 9 component areas. And yet 2 years later, okay, it grew. From 9, it became 16. And if a sub-region like this grew in size, okay, it should also grow in terms of organization. You also, realize that problems may also multiply. So harder coordination, okay, ensued, okay, and then the larger the scope of the BIMP-IAGA now, the harder it was to coordinate policies, and the wider the region, okay, the more probable that certain areas will lag behind and result in a repeat instance of a periphery within a sub-region itself. Okay. And finally, not only does BIMP-IAGA have a big or wide membership, but also widely separated component areas, which poses more challenges than advantages to the sub-region. Okay. So geographical proximity is essentially one of those so-called 4 standards, okay, on which we can actually evaluate success or lack of success, okay, of a sub-regional economic cooperation. Okay. And again, if I may mention here, well, the BIMP-IAGA is primarily initiated as an engine of economic growth, okay, and development in the particular sub-regions of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. It's important to note that these governments, okay, in the BIMP-IAGA has also used the growth polygon as a mechanism to reduce the underlying security tensions in their own countries. So BIMP-IAGA member countries also have security problems, okay. And now I move to this recent development in the BIMP-IAGA, this growing focus and engagement of China, okay, on BIMP-IAGA. So it started in 2003 when China first expressed its commitment to support the revitalization of BIMP-IAGA. But it took it 6 years later, okay, when BIMP-IAGA and China signed this so-called framework for economic cooperation. And under such framework, around 9 areas of cooperation were actually identified, from agriculture to forestry to infrastructure to development of alternative sources of fuel to finance. Although later these 9 would be, streamlined to become 7. And the engagement of China with BIMP-IAGA is actually based on the BIMP-IAGA Vision 2025 that emphasizes BIMP-IAGA's collaboration with country development partners for their potential as either project financiers, technical assistance providers, knowledge partners, and value-adding contributors. And then another 9 years have passed before the first ministerial level meeting was held between China and BIMP-IAGA in 2018. And then that was when both parties agreed to enhance their cooperation. Okay, so there was this plan of action for BIMP-IAGA China cooperation. Now, in a virtual webinar, okay, on BIMP-IAGA China boosting trade and economic ties, okay, 4 areas for enhancing cooperation were identified, and you can find there on the slides: in strengthening strategic alignment to advance post-COVID-19 pandemic recovery, making good use of free trade agreements, leveraging financial support to enhance development capacity, and encouraging innovation-driven subnational cooperation, as many Chinese coastal provinces have a long history of interactions and close trade ties with BIMP-IAGA. However, certain concerns, okay, not only within BIMP-IAGA but also between China and BIMP-IAGA are basically present, okay, that may actually shape, okay, how this cooperation between China and BIMP-IAGA would evolve, let's say, over time, okay. So in the context of the COVID-19 global pandemic and the challenges of post-pandemic recovery, China may be a strategic development partner of BIMP-IAGA. It has the capacity to provide resources to support BIMP-IAGA, for example, in the areas of infrastructure, digital economy, agriculture, green technology, public health, tourism, industrial parks, or human capacity building, okay? But those potentials may be affected by these key issues relating to BIMP-IAGA China cooperation. And in this particular roundtable discussion, 3 sets of issues were actually identified. One would be on centering on economic and development concerns, the other one on political and security concerns, and of course the third one would be issues concerning credibility of China. So to be quick, in terms of economic and development concerns, the main issue here is that BIMP-IAGA's negotiations with China is that each of the member states wants to be at the forefront. rather than projecting a unified sub-regional vision of cooperation. But I think this has become like a trademark of the ASEAN member countries, okay? Especially in light of the Asian financial crisis. Okay, instead of coming up with, let's say, a sub-regional unified effort, okay, the so-called priority policy is, of course, a national recovery. And just like any other investors, Chinese investors would also have to deal with the usual problems of investors, high transport, logistic costs, illegal trade, high cost of production, etc. Okay. And then in terms of political and security concerns, I think this also is equally important. Okay? Several political security issues can actually, for example, presence of terrorists and rebel groups, kidnapping of ransom gangs, etc. Beijing may be prepared or should be prepared, no, for transnational policy or political and security risks that may arise and will spill over to economic cooperation. And the third set of issues there were like issues of credibility of China. In that particular roundtable discussion, it was noted that China has so many entrepreneurs who are interested to engage in different projects, including some of an illegal nature. So partner countries may benefit, but they have to be wary or to be cautious about it. Now, some more underlying concerns within IAGA, okay, would be, number one, there are ongoing territorial and maritime disputes among the countries. Terrorism and piracy remain active. Organizationally, BIMP-IAGA has a rather loose structure that is built on an IAGA-wide international coordination framework, and that prevents, for example, member countries to act on their own or to decide judiciously. BIMP-IAGA does not have its own funds ever since. Okay, member countries, fund their own activities. Competing private sector organizations, particularly in the context of Philippines IAGA, and the primacy of national over sub-regional interests, particularly in times of crisis. Again, just look back at what happened during the Asian financial crisis. And number 6 is like a sort of summarizing the remaining, issues regarding BIMP-IAGA. Okay, and as a way of concluding, okay, my presentation for this morning, okay, I want to end with a happy note by inviting you to visit, okay, not 1, not 2, but 6 UNESCO. UNESCO heritage sites, World Heritage Sites in BIMP-IAGA. So with that, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Diana. Next, I will give time for 5 to 6 minutes for Professor Gu to give her remarks. Time is yours.
Okay, hello, good morning, Dr. Mendoza. I'm Bokyeung from the KIAS. And your article, the past and present challenges or the new opportunity is very interesting for me because I also study on the BIMP-IAGA. Then it is a great pleasure to discuss your article today. And so your article indicated the BIMP-IAGA is still far from delivering the benefits on a sub-regional economic cooperation because of the lack of economic complementarity and the poor common infrastructure and the geographically wide membership. And I also agree with your critical sides, especially the geographically wide membership. And the BIMP-IAGA established one more economic coordinary just last month, Northwest economy. At the moment, they have 4 economic coordinary. But they are working mainly Borneo Island, and that it doesn't cover like Maluku and Papua and Palawan also, because these areas are too far from the Borneo. Yeah. And I think the BIMP-IAGA seems that Borneo is the only place to develop. And then I would like to add one more reason that why BIMP-IAGA is still far from the reaping the benefits. It's related with the China case also. I think the political issues are also very important, and political risk and the FDI influence had a strong relationship. And for example, it's like on 2017, the Philippine IAGA's FDI was decreased 72% compared to the last year. Even like 2017, Philippines total FDI has increased like 21%. And that reason is the Philippine NESA said the martial law on the South Island of Mindanao has affected the investment and the economies. And Malaysia had a similar case in the same years. Malaysia IAGA decreased 86% decreased because they had the issue of political uncertainty, such as US-China trade frictions on same years. So I think it can be happen with China. For example, like by virtue of its 9-dash line in South China Sea, China has overlapping territories or maritime disputes with all of BIMPIAGA countries. And why the South China Sea disputes do not necessarily prevent the China BIMPIAGA cooperation? Maybe any intensification of the disputes will negatively impact the later, I think. So I would like to listen your opinion to like a political risk in the development with China and the relationship. Okay, I would like to finish shortly because the lunchtime is coming on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Gu. Do you have any response?
Well, just say thank you very much. Take note, okay, of the observations made. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think there are a number of questions already coming in for you. The first question is from Mr. Sandira Harjo. Presentation about major impediment in the economic transformation of BIMPIAGA are actually some reasons why BIMPIAGA sought to be established. What are the significant contribution or main differences before and after the establishment of BIMPIAGA?
Okay. So I think that question would require another paper presentation in another conference, but maybe focusing on Philippines IAGA, for instance, okay? It was launched and it was actually initiated by Philippine President Ramos then, and it was formally launched in 1994. But before that, President Ramos then visited, for example, Malaysia in 1993. And just like what I said earlier, that was a critical juncture because that was a very first state visit of a Philippine president in Malaysia, okay, in an almost 30-year period. Okay, so talking about bilateral relations, for example, between Philippines and Malaysia, I think that's something that is really, significant and let's say important. And then number two, the organization of BIMP-IAGA has grown not only in terms of the component areas, okay, that make up BIMP-IAGA, but at the same time, or consequently creating more problems. Okay, when they were expanding and extending these component areas of BIMP-IAGA, member countries and their governments were basically a bit excited and enthusiastic without necessarily anticipating problems of coordination, okay, and problems of, let's say, establishing dialogues between and, let's say, among them. Okay, now in terms of political commitment, okay, or political will, that's so hard to measure, for example, in the area of political science, for instance, but this continuous summits, leadership meetings or leader summits, okay, make being minimalist, at least they're meeting and coming up with all these so-called important documents, okay, that renew their commitment, for example, to promote and, let's say, expand and, let's say, to make this BIMP-IAGA succeed. So I think that's another important positive or, let's say, favorable change, okay. But BIMP-IAGA dynamics is like a microcosm of the broader ASEAN dynamics. My colleagues earlier, Professor Atienza and Professor Lusterio, were basically talking also about the so-called features of the broader ASEAN, okay, as a region, right? And BIMP-IAGA is like, a microcosm, okay? The ASEAN way, the so-called non-interference, national sovereignty, these are also not just mimic, no, but also invoke in the context of, let's say, BIMP-IAGA. And I think I mentioned earlier, the so-called IAGA-wide institutional coordination is also, let's say, a limitation, okay, because it doesn't provide clear mandates on what member countries can actually do on their own, or can they things that they can do basically individually or separately or as essentially as a whole, okay. Well, this may extend a bit the discussion that I made here, okay, but definitely since we're going to have this presidential election soon, okay, on May 9, okay, that would also change maybe or reconfigure or change a bit the texture between the relationship between Philippines and, let's say, that of China, okay, because investment, for example, of China on the Philippines, okay, can be broadly, captured in this so-called 3 Bs, build, build, build. okay, project, okay, and I've been told like that's very Chinese. In Chinese, if something is important, they say it twice, not once, not twice, but twice. So build, build, build is basically like a trademark of Chinese, I don't know, value added, for example, in the Philippines, okay, but maybe that would be on the surface or the the tip of the iceberg, because if we look individually, okay, the big IAGA member countries, they have all their domestic issues as well. Sabah, for example, is something that Philippines and Malaysia wouldn't want to talk about, something like that. Piracy, terrorism, and all, okay. Even the illegal immigrants, for example, in Sabah, Filipinos, that has been, let's say, a red flag in terms of relations between Philippines and that of Malaysia. Okay. What else? Okay.
Yeah, there are two more questions. I think
Yeah.
you can answer this quickly. The first question is from Mr. Talampas. How do security environment and security related initiative inform or shape BIM IAGA development trust, especially in Sulu, Sulawesi area?
Okay. So Mindanao, for example, is very interesting. The poorest provinces in the Philippines are found. And it's not only the poorest provinces of the Philippines, but peace and security and order problems are essentially very present. Okay, so we have this so-called long-running, almost eternal problem. For example, conflict. I'll just broadly call it like conflict, okay, so that I won't digress, okay, from the material that I, let's say, presented, okay. But that's something, of course, that has to be, taken into consideration. But looking at the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region Muslim Mindanao Organic Act, to date, no, there are still questions and contestations about how some interest, identities, and agendas, okay, were not actually incorporated there. Okay, I remember in 1999, okay, that was like 5 years after BIMP IAGA was formally launched, okay, that was the first time I ever presented a paper on BIMP IAGA, and the occasion was like an academic cooperation in Sabah, Malaysia. That was like 5 years after 1994 launching of BIMP IAGA, and it was like a sort of, let's say, evaluation of what has become of BIMP IAGA. And in that particular paper, which I actually co-wrote with a friend and collaborator, we focus on the so-called people side of the BIMP IAGA, let's say, project, okay? So we focus on the role of the Philippines, for example, and the issues and challenges that emerge, particularly those relating to Mindanao, one of the component areas of BIMP IAGA. And in that paper, we highlighted two, differing opinions about the BIMP IAGA. On the one hand, we have the advocates of BIMP IAGA, you have the private sector, because BIMP IAGA is private sector led and market driven, and of course the government sector, which are very favorable, okay, or agreeable to this BIMP IAGA growth polygon project, okay. And it was seen as an effort to establish a community that upholds the spirit of solidarity, cooperation, and coordination, and one that institutionalizes centuries-old cultural and market links, right, among the respective regions in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. But on the other hand, local and indigenous peoples, okay, and groups in Mindanao saw some constraints in the process, okay, of implementing the BIMP IAGA. So let's take, for example, major stakeholders had identified, of course, peace and order, security problems as most pressing issues. There were also valid observations that these nagging peace and order issues in the sub-regions tend to hinder whatever meaningful integration that they may have in the IAGA's development plan, okay? And that discussion of armed den in the IAGA cannot be isolated from the broader Muslim, problem in Mindanao, okay? And one dominant view then, okay, based on a roundtable focus group discussion, okay, there was a general impression that there was a lack of understanding, okay, among the private sector, Mindanao in the IAGA concept, and our Muslim brothers and sisters in Sulu, Tawi-Tawi, and Basilan felt that they did not significantly figure in the IAGA and were alarmed, that the IAGA project would lead to further discrimination, okay? So I think political security tensions are always tied up, okay, with economic inequities and inequalities, and I think the two should, be it's not like which one should be addressed first or which one comes next. I think the two should be tied together, okay, because so long as people felt marginalized, dislocated, displaced, there's no way for them to be to accept, okay, whatever potential promise that BIMP IAGA may lead to, okay.
All right, and there are two more questions, but our time is up, but maybe you can answer this quickly. The first question is, will China's interest in BIM-IAGA affect ADB support from BIM-IAGA? And the second one is, did the local government in BIM-IAGA provide any financial support for BIM-IAGA?
Since 1996, ADB has become the regional development advisor of BIM-IAGA, and since 2015, ADB has been, providing technical assistance. I think by 2018, they have already concluded 2 technical assistance projects. And what's so interesting about the evaluation of those particular projects is that in terms of lessons learned and in terms of, let's say, limitations and problems, okay, that could actually be drawn, no, from the 2 technical assistance projects, okay, they still mirror, they still echo the same issues that I have actually listed earlier, okay. China, China is China, okay. It would create a venue whereby it could be relevant, okay. Maybe that's my way of responding to it, okay. Right, what else?
The last question,
Governments in BIM
yeah.
provide any financial support for BIM-IAGA? BIM-IAGA is private sector led and market driven. So you have LGUs, but LGU's role are not, on top of the so-called agenda for cooperation or, let's say, partnership. And I think that's one area, and that's where one problem basically lies.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.